In the last few videos, we have been moving through Model L as a sequence of structural lenses. First, we looked at capacity, what comes easily, what resists focus, and how the type's strengths and weaknesses are distributed. Then we looked at vergence, what is explicit or implicit in awareness, and what the type engages by default or only by alternative engagement. Then current, what the type favors, what it leans into, and how this expands Model A's simple valued and unvalued division. Then perspective and array, the ways functions frame, compose, assess, and support decision-making. Now we come to interest, but interest here does not simply mean what someone likes, what hobbies they have, or what subjects they happen to enjoy talking about. In Model L, interest is more structural than that. It concerns the way attention is distributed, what the type focuses on boldly, what it handles more discreetly, what becomes a pertinent concern, and what remains merely incidental. So in this video, we are going to unpack the 4 interest groups: Salient, Adjunct, Germane, and Tangential. And we will see how Model L expands the familiar Model A distinction between bold and cautious functions into a richer 4-part structure. By this point, the Model L layout has started to look less like a list of functions and more like a sequence of lenses. Each lens asks a different question of the same 16 positions. Some lenses ask about ease and resistance. Some ask about awareness. Some ask about value, output, framing, or decision-making. Interest asks a more attentional question: what does the type notice strongly? What receives only indirect attention? What feels like a genuine concern? And what stays at the edge of relevance? So this is not yet about what a person is good at, what they value most, or what they decide from. It is about how their attention is oriented before action fully takes shape. In Model A, this territory is usually approached through the distinction between bold and cautious functions. Model L keeps that distinction but opens it out into 4 separate positions of attention: Salient, Adjunct, Germane, and Tangential. The word interest can be misleading at first. In ordinary speech, we use it to mean the things someone likes, their hobbies, favorite topics, or personal fascinations. But in Model L, interest is not mainly about content. It is about orientation. A function can be drawn into attention strongly or handled more discreetly. It can be tied to something the type treats as genuinely relevant, or it can remain more incidental to the main line of concern. So interest describes a kind of attentional geometry. Where does focus intensify? Where does it spread out? Where does the type register something as important? And where does something remain present but peripheral? This is why interest is not the same as strength, value, or conscious awareness. A person may be capable in an area without making it a central concern. They may value something without constantly concentrating on it, and they may notice something without treating it as the point of the matter. Interest names that distinction. It tells us how a type's attention is weighted, what comes to the front, what stays to the side, what matters directly, and what only enters the picture indirectly. The easiest way into this part of Model L is through the familiar Model A distinction between bold and cautious functions. In Model A, some functions are treated as bold. They come forward more readily, are easier to speak from, and are less hidden in the personality. Others are cautious. They are handled more carefully, more indirectly, or with less obvious confidence. That distinction is still important, but Model L asks what is being compressed inside it, because a function can be bold in the sense that attention goes there readily without necessarily being one of the type's most relevant concerns, and a function can be cautious in expression, while still mattering quite a lot to the way the type orients itself. So Model L does not simply discard bold and cautious. It separates the question of how strongly attention concentrates from the question of how relevant the concern is. Once those two questions are separated, the simple Model A pair opens into 4 interest groups: Salient, Adjunct, Germane, and Tangential. The first function-level axis behind interest is bold versus discrete. This is where we need to be careful with the terminology. In Model L, the interest groups are not built directly from the Reinin dichotomy of intensive and extensive. They are built from the corresponding function dichotomy, bold and discrete. A bold function is one the type more readily brings forward. Attention gathers around it more prominently. It is easier to place in the foreground, easier to speak from, and more obvious in the type's functional presentation. A discrete function is different. It is still part of the structure, but it is handled in a more indirect, off-handed, or less prominently concentrated way. It does not announce itself in the same manner. So the important contrast here is not present versus absent. Both sides are present. The question is whether the function receives a more prominent concentration of attention, or whether it remains more discrete in the way it is attended to. Kimani's terms intensive and extensive belong at the Reinin level. They are his rephrasing of introversion and extraversion. So we can say that bold and discrete correspond to intensive and extensive at the Reinin level, but we should not collapse the two layers into one. For interest, the function-level distinction is bold or discrete. The practical difference between bold and discrete is not whether a function exists in awareness. Both are part of the type's functioning. The difference is how attention comes forward. A bold function is easier to place at the front of the presentation. The type can more readily speak from it, display it, and use it as an obvious point of focus. A discrete function is handled more indirectly. It may still be used, it may still inform what the type is doing, but it is less likely to become the visible center of attention. So the contrast is not active versus inactive or important versus unimportant. It is more precise than that. Bold functions are more openly concentrated. Discrete functions are more offhandedly concentrated. This is the first ingredient of interest. Before we ask whether a function is a major concern, we first ask how prominently attention gathers around it. The second function-level axis behind interest is attentional concern. If focal concentration asks how prominently attention gathers, attentional concern asks a different question. Does this function belong to the type's field of concern? At the function level, the distinction is pertinent versus incidental. A pertinent function is not merely noticed. It is treated as relevant to what the type is tracking. It belongs to the matter at hand. An incidental function may still appear and may still be used, but it does not carry the same sense of direct relevance. It sits more to the side of the type's main concern. So this axis is not asking whether attention is bold or discrete. It is asking whether the function is central to the concern or only incidental to it. Kimani's corresponding Reinin terms here are constructive and corrective, his clarification of the classical, positivist, and negativist distinction. So again, there are two layers. At the function level, interest uses pertinent/incidental. At the Reinin level, this corresponds to constructive/corrective. Together with focal concentration, this gives us the two questions behind interest. How prominently does attention gather, and how directly does the function matter as a concern? The practical difference between pertinent and incidental is not whether something is noticed. Both can be noticed. The difference is whether the function enters the type's main field of concern. A pertinent function is treated as relevant to the matter at hand. It connects to what the type is actually tracking, weighing, or caring about in the situation. It has a place in the central concern. An incidental function is different. It may still appear, it may still be recognized, it may even be used when the situation calls for it. But it is not treated as the main point. It remains more secondary, auxiliary, or peripheral to what the type is really concerned with. So the contrast is not noticed versus unnoticed, or useful versus useless. It is a question of relevance. Pertinent functions are drawn into the concern itself. Incidental functions remain alongside it. This gives us the second ingredient of interest. First, focal concentration asks how prominently attention gathers. Then, attentional concern asks whether the function actually belongs to the matter at hand. Once we put the two axes together, we get the four interest groups. The first axis asks whether attention is bold or discrete. Does the function come forward with concentration, or does it remain more distributed and indirect? The second axis asks whether the concern is pertinent or incidental. Is this function tied to what the type treats as relevant, or does it remain more peripheral to the main concern? When attention is both bold and pertinent, we get salient interest. When it is bold but only incidental, we get adjunct interest. When it is discrete but still pertinent, we get Germane interest. And when it is both discrete and incidental, we get tangential interest. This is the point where Model L becomes more precise than the simple bold/cautious distinction, because two functions can both look bold but not matter in the same way, and two functions can both look cautious, while one remains quietly relevant and the other stays genuinely peripheral. So the four interests are not just four labels, they describe four different ways attention and concern combine. The first interest group is salient interest. This is where the two axes are both at their most direct. The function is bold, so attention gathers around it strongly. It comes forward. It is easier to concentrate through, easier to speak from, and less hidden in the personality, but it is also pertinent. That means it is not merely visible, it is relevant to what the type is actually tracking. It belongs to the main field of concern. So, salient interest describes functions that are both prominent in attention and genuinely important to the type's orientation. These are the places where the type does not have to search very hard to know what matters. The concern is close to the surface. It is not just available, it is foregrounded. In Model A, this is the side of interest that most closely corresponds to the familiar idea of bold functions. But Model L lets us say more precisely why they are bold. They are not only easier to bring forward, they also sit in the zone where attention and relevance reinforce one another. The second interest group is adjunct interest. Here, attention is still bold. The function can come forward clearly. It may be easy to notice, easy to activate, and relatively easy for the type to speak from. But unlike salient interest, it is incidental rather than pertinent. That means it does not sit at the center of what the type is fundamentally tracking. It can be visible without being central. It can be active without being the main point. This is why adjunct interest is easy to misunderstand if we only use the Model A language of bold and cautious. From the outside, an adjunct function may look quite prominent. It may show itself confidently enough, but structurally it is not where the type's deepest concern is located. It supports, accompanies, or branches off from the main line of attention. So adjunct interest gives us a useful distinction. Not everything that comes forward strongly is equally important. Some functions are bold because attention can gather around them, but they remain secondary in the type's field of concern. The third interest group is Germane interest. Here, the function is discrete. It does not usually come forward with the same boldness or obvious emphasis. It may be quieter, less declarative, and less immediately visible from the outside, but it is still pertinent. That is the important part. A germane function may not dominate attention, but it still belongs to the type's field of concern. It still has relevance. It still matters to how the type orients itself. So, germane interest helps us avoid a common mistake. We should not assume that whatever is less obvious is therefore unimportant. Some concerns are not shouted from the front of the personality. They are carried more quietly. They may appear through hesitation, careful checking, selective attention, or the way a person keeps returning to something without making it the center of their presentation. In Model A, this does not have a neat equivalent, because Model A tends to fold this territory into the broader category of cautious. But Model L separates the two issues. A function can be discrete in how attention gathers around it, while still being genuinely relevant to the type's concerns. That is germane interest, not loud, not central in expression, but still meaningfully connected to what matters. The fourth interest group is tangential interest. Here, both axes are at their least central. The function is discrete, so attention does not gather around it strongly. It is not usually brought forward with emphasis, confidence, or clear concentration, and it is also incidental. That means it is not closely tied to the type's main field of concern. It may still appear when the situation calls for it, but it does not usually feel like the point of the matter. So tangential interest describes functions that sit at the edge of attention and concern. They are not necessarily absent, they are not necessarily impossible to use, but they are not where the type naturally concentrates. and they are not what the type most readily treats as relevant. This is the interest group that most closely corresponds to the familiar Model A idea of cautious functions. But again, Model L gives us a more exact description. Tangential does not simply mean weak. It does not simply mean unconscious. It means that the function is both discrete in attention and incidental in concern. It enters the picture at the margins. It may be noticed, adjusted to, or dealt with when necessary, but structurally it remains peripheral to where the type's attention and concern most naturally gather. The value of this distinction is that it stops us from flattening attention into a single scale. In Model A, bold and cautious are useful terms, but on their own, they can make it seem as though the only question is whether a function comes forward strongly or not. Model L adds a second question. Does this actually belong to the type's field of concern? Once we ask both questions, the picture becomes more precise. Salient functions come forward and matter directly. Adjunct functions come forward but remain secondary. Germane functions may be quiet but still matter. Tangential functions remain peripheral in both attention and concern. That means we should be careful when reading behavior. Something visible is not always central, something quiet is not always unimportant. A type may speak confidently from a function without treating it as the main point, and a type may return again and again to a concern without displaying it loudly. So interest gives us a better language for the weighting of attention. It helps us ask not only what appears, but what role that appearance has in the structure of the type. So interest gives us one more structural lens for reading the 16 positions. It is not asking what a person likes. It is not asking what they are strongest at, and it is not simply asking what they value. It asks how attention and concern are weighted. Some functions come forward and matter directly, some come forward but remain secondary, some are quiet but still relevant, and some stay at the edge of the type's natural field of concern. That gives us a more careful way to read behavior. We do not have to assume that the loudest thing is always the deepest concern, and we do not have to assume that the quieter thing is merely absent or irrelevant. Model L lets us separate visibility from importance. That is the real purpose of the interest groups: salient, adjunct, germane, and tangential. They show us where attention gathers, where it branches, where it stays quietly connected, and where it remains peripheral. In the next video, we move to another structural lens: Purview. If interest asks what draws attention as a concern, Purview asks what occupies the type more broadly over time. Not just what comes into focus, but what tends to hold the field.